He always said that the truth didn't come to him in a flash of terror or a moment of wild disbelief. It arrived slowly, like the whisper of wind through the pines, slipping into his life without warning. He had gone to the mountains seeking silence, hoping to escape the noise of a world that no longer felt like home. What he found instead was a presence that defied every rule of nature he had ever known. A presence older than memory, larger than myth, and more human than anyone could imagine. At first, he dismissed the distant knocks in the night, the heavy breathing beyond the tree-line, the massive footprints appearing near his cabin after fresh snowfall. But the signs grew bolder, more deliberate. Something out there was watching him, not with hunger, but with curiosity. The forest felt alive in new ways. Shadows moved with intention. Branches bent at odd angles. Silence stretched between trees like a held breath. He began to understand that he was not alone, and that he was being observed by something extraordinary. People spend their lives chasing stories about what might live in the wilderness, but he didn't chase anything. The truth came to him. It approached quietly, testing boundaries, studying his routine. Every moment felt like part of a conversation he didn't yet know how to interpret. He had no reason to fear the presence. Instead, he felt a strange pull, a sense of recognition he could not explain. The forest was changing him, preparing him for a revelation that would reshape the next 2 decades of his life. The night he first saw the figure standing against the dusk, tall, massive, covered in brown fur that shimmered under the fading light, he didn't run. He felt awe, not terror. Its eyes glowed with amber warmth, intelligent and ancient, as if carrying the weight of forgotten worlds. In that moment, he understood that legends had never been legends. They were memories, misunderstood, ignored, and buried under generations of disbelief. The being didn't attack or flee. It simply observed him with the calm patience of a guardian. From that day forward, their lives intertwined. Days became lessons, nights became silent conversations, and seasons became chapters in a story he never dared to share. The forest opened itself to him, revealing hidden paths, sacred clearings, and rhythms that only the guardian understood. He learned to listen not with his ears, but with his instincts, with the space between breaths, the tremble of earth, the pulse of wind. And through it all, the guardian remained at his side, guiding him deeper into a world untouched by human hands. But their bond was not built on wonder alone. It was forged through danger, storms, injuries, and the relentless presence of unseen threats lurking beyond the mountains. 20 years brought trials that tested both man and guardian, moments when survival hung by a thread, when silence hid predators far darker than any legend. Each challenge strengthened their connection, weaving their lives together with trust that transcended language or fear. They were no longer two beings from different worlds, they were companions. Now, as he tells his story to those willing to listen, he knows most will doubt him. They will dismiss his truth as imagination or fantasy. But for him, the last 20 years were more real than anything he had known before. He lived with a being the world refuses to believe exists. He learned from it, protected it, and was protected in return. And as he begins to reveal the extraordinary journey they shared, he offers only one promise: once you hear what happened in those mountains, you will never look at the wilderness the same way again. He always said the story began long before he realized it. Back then, he was just a quiet man living near the foothills of the Olympic Mountains, tending to a small cabin his grandfather had left behind. The forest around him felt ancient, full of whispers and moving shadows that never seemed threatening, only watchful. Every morning, he would wake before dawn, listening to the wind slide through the pines like a long breath drawn by something enormous. He never imagined that something would one day reveal itself. He never expected that a presence beyond human understanding was already observing him, studying him, waiting for the right moment to step forward. His days passed in a comfortable rhythm, splitting firewood, checking traps, and fishing along the cold river that traced a silver path through the valley. It was a simple existence, one that helped him forget the noise of the world he had left behind. Yet beneath this quiet life, a strange pattern began to emerge. Tools left hanging would shift slightly overnight. Tracks he didn't recognize appeared near the shed, too large for any known animal, too deep for the soft soil they were pressed into. They seemed deliberate, as if left for him to notice. Still, he dismissed them as tricks of erosion or the signs of a wandering black bear. One night, while sharpening his knife by lantern light, he heard slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. They did not sound frantic or predatory, they were steady, controlled, almost testing his reaction. His heart hammered as he blew out the lantern and sat perfectly still in the darkness. The footsteps paused near the window. He could feel a presence on the other side of the wooden wall, immense and curious. The silence stretched until the forest exhaled again, and the footsteps retreated into the trees. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, he found impressions in the soft dirt, massive, humanoid tracks shaped like enormous bare feet. Each print was impossibly clear, each toe outlined with precision. He crouched beside them, pressing his palm into one. His entire hand barely covered half of the footprint. Every instinct told him to pack up and leave the mountains behind, but another part of him, the part that grew up listening to indigenous legends, whispered that he was being approached, not hunted. Something powerful wanted to understand him. Days later, while gathering firewood deep in the wooded ravine, he felt something watching again. The sensation wasn't threatening, it was more like being evaluated. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. For a moment, he saw nothing but dense branches shaped by years of wind and snow. But then a figure shifted behind a cedar trunk, huge, still, blending with the shadows. He saw only a glimpse, brown fur, massive shoulders, and eyes reflecting the weak winter light like polished amber stones. When he blinked, the figure was gone, as if it had melted into the forest itself. That night, the forest felt different. The usual rustles and nocturnal calls were absent, replaced by a vast, heavy quiet. Sitting on the porch with a cup of bitter coffee, he sensed movement at the tree line again. Something walked parallel to the clearing, not approaching this time but circling with confidence. He could hear the weight of each step, the subtle shift of branches, the breathing of something alive, intelligent, and cautious. He whispered into the darkness, unsure why, "I'm not here to harm you." The movement stopped for a long moment, as though his words had been understood. The following morning, he woke to find a pile of river stones arranged neatly in a circular pattern near the porch. They were smooth, wet, and placed with deliberate care. He had no explanation for how they arrived there overnight without a single sound. As he examined the stones, he realized they weren't random. They were arranged in the same pattern the indigenous elders used to represent peaceful contact in seasonal gatherings. The message was unmistakable, something wanted to communicate. Over the next week, more signs appeared. A thick branch had been placed upright against the cabin door, not blocking entry but positioned like a marker. A fresh deer hide was left near the path he used to fetch water each morning. Footprints continued to appear, always close, always unmistakable, yet never crossing into the boundary of the cabin itself. It was as if the being respected invisible lines humans rarely perceived. His fear slowly transformed into fascination. He spent long nights sitting on the porch, lantern extinguished, eyes adjusting to the darkness. He listened carefully for every subtle shift in the forest's rhythm. He catalogued each sign, each footprint, each strange gift left at the edge of the clearing. Something extraordinary was unfolding, something he could not explain to anyone without sounding unhinged. Yet he felt no madness, only a rising certainty that he was not alone. One quiet evening, a soft vocalization echoed from the trees, deep, resonant, and layered with tones he couldn't decipher. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a howl. It was something deliberate, almost conversational. The sound stirred a memory from childhood, a story his grandfather once told about forest guardians who spoke in voices that blended with the mountains themselves. As he listened, the vocalization shifted, responding in intervals as though waiting for an answer. He whispered back, unsure what else to do. The forest settled into a deeper calm. Later that week, while checking traplines near the ridge, he saw the enormous figure again, this time fully illuminated by the midday sun. The being stepped out from behind a fallen log with a fluid grace contradicting its immense size. Brown fur rippled across its muscular frame. Its posture was upright, unmistakably humanoid, yet far more massive than any man. They stood several yards apart, neither moving. The being tilted its head slightly, observing him with an expression that resembled curiosity more than aggression. He felt no urge to run. Instead, he lowered his gaze slightly in a gesture of respect he'd learned from native friends. In the weeks that followed, he found himself moving through the forest with a growing sense of awareness. Every sound felt sharper, every shift in the wind more meaningful. He no longer treated the woods as an empty wilderness but as a place inhabited by an unseen intelligence. He took deliberate steps, avoiding sudden movements or loud noises. When he gathered firewood, he stacked it neatly rather than leaving scattered scraps. When he fished at the stream, he whispered thanks before leaving the water. Something had changed in him, as if the forest had adopted him into its quiet, ancient etiquette. One morning, a soft knocking echoed through the trees, 3 slow strikes against wood. It wasn't random, it carried intention. He recognized it from the stories of loggers who once claimed to hear similar signals before seeing towering figures hidden among fir trees. He hesitated, then responded with a gentle tap of his own on a nearby stump. The forest held its breath. After a long pause, 3 knocks returned, this time closer, deeper, resonating like distant thunder. The exchange felt like an invitation to step deeper into a world few humans ever entered. As he followed a narrow trail along the ridge, he noticed branches angled in specific directions, forming a subtle pathway. The positioning was too precise to be accidental. Each branch pointed toward a natural corridor between moss-covered boulders, guiding him forward like markers placed by a being who understood the terrain far better than he did. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything. The deeper he went, the stronger the sensation that he was being observed, not hunted, but guided, like a student on his first walk through sacred grounds. At the end of the corridor, he found a clearing he had never seen before. Sunlight poured through the canopy in soft golden shafts, illuminating a wide patch of trampled grass. The center held a large log stripped of bark, smoother than anything nature could have crafted alone. It looked like a seat carved by time and intention. As he approached, he felt the air change, a shift in pressure, a presence beyond the senses. Then, from the shadows, a deep exhale drifted through the clearing. He knew instantly he was not alone. The being stepped forward slowly, each footfall heavy enough to vibrate through the soil. Brown fur shimmered under the filtered sunlight, revealing scars and patterns that hinted at a lifetime spent navigating the wild. Its eyes glowed with the same amber warmth he had seen before. It didn't growl or roar. It simply stood there, breathing steadily, watching him as if weighing his readiness. He kept his hands visible, palms open, and lowered himself onto the carved log, signaling trust. The being tilted its head, observing him with what felt like cautious approval. Minutes passed in near silence, broken only by the distant rustling of wind brushing through cedar branches. Then the being made a low, resonant hum, deep, layered, almost melodic. The vibration passed through the air, settling into his chest like a calming pulse. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. When he opened them again, the being had stepped closer, closing part of the distance between them. Its presence felt immense yet strangely comforting, like standing beside an old friend whose language needed no words. The being extended one long arm and tapped the log twice with its knuckles. The message was clear: listen. It repeated the hum, this time shifting the tone slightly, as if demonstrating something. He tried to mimic it, producing a shaky, uneven version of the sound. The being paused, then hummed again, patient, encouraging. They continued this exchange for several minutes until he managed a tone close enough that the being responded with a soft rumble that felt like approval. It was the first lesson in communication, raw and instinctive. For the next few days, he returned to the clearing, sometimes alone, sometimes greeted by the being standing among the trees. Their interactions remained simple: sounds, gestures, patterns drawn in dirt. He learned to recognize its moods by the angle of its shoulders, the tilt of its head, the pace of its breathing. In turn, it seemed to study his habits, observing how he moved, how he reacted to certain noises, how he approached or retreated. There was no threat between them, only a slow building of trust built on patience and mutual respect. One afternoon, rain drummed softly across the canopy as he stood in the clearing, waiting. The being appeared from the mist, steam rising subtly from its fur. Instead of staying at the edge of the trees, it approached more boldly, standing less than 10 feet away. He felt the weight of its gaze, not predatory but evaluating. With deliberate motion, it reached into a pouch made of woven plant fibers and placed a large, smooth river stone at his feet. The gesture was foreign yet deeply symbolic. He knelt and touched the stone gently, realizing it was a gift. He knew from indigenous stories that such gifts meant acceptance, recognition of spirit and presence. When he looked up, the being had lowered its posture slightly, almost mirroring a bow. He responded with a respectful nod, unsure what else to offer in return. After a moment, the being turned and disappeared into the fog, leaving behind the stone as a silent promise of connection. He carried it back to the cabin and placed it on the mantel, understanding that his life had crossed into a new realm of meaning. Over time, he felt the forest itself shift around him. Animals behaved differently when he walked by, less startled, more curious. The wind carried scents he had never noticed before: deep earth, crushed pine, something wild yet familiar. At night, distant knocks echoed through the valley, forming patterns that he began to recognize. Sometimes the being answered his own knocks, sometimes he listened as it communicated with others farther away. The forest was not empty, it was alive with voices he had only just begun to hear. By the end of that season, he realized something remarkable: the being was not just observing him. It was teaching him. Teaching him how to listen to the land, how to move with intention, how to interpret sounds and signs that humans had forgotten to notice. Each encounter strengthened a bond that went beyond curiosity. He understood then that this relation. As the first winter snow settled across the mountains, he noticed that the being's visits became more frequent. Heavy footfalls circled the cabin at dusk, never crossing the porch but remaining close enough that he felt its presence like a warm pulse beneath the cold air. He had learned not to fear the sound. Instead, he opened the door slowly, letting the lantern's glow spill gently into the darkness. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of huge eyes reflecting the light from beyond the tree line. Other nights, he heard nothing but quiet breathing, steady and patient, as if the being was keeping watch. One freezing evening, a storm rolled across the valley with violent winds and sleet that cracked against the cabin walls. He prepared to wait out the worst of it beside the fireplace, but a sudden thud struck the door, hard, deliberate, and urgent. Startled, he grabbed his lantern and opened the door a crack. Through the swirling snow, he saw the massive shape hunched near the porch, bracing itself against the storm. The being was injured, leaning heavily on one arm, its fur matted with ice and streaked with dark stains. It hadn't come to intimidate him. It had come for help. Without hesitation, he stepped aside and beckoned it into the shelter of the porch. The being moved with visible pain, each breath a low, rumbling groan that vibrated through the wooden boards. It didn't try to enter the cabin, respecting the boundary it had never crossed, but it lowered itself near the wall, shivering as the winds tore through the clearing. He fetched blankets, hot water, and a handful of herbs he'd learned from old field guides. He didn't know if they would work, but he had to try. The being watched him closely, its amber eyes softening with something that resembled gratitude. When he approached the wound, a deep gash across its shoulder. The being tensed but didn't pull away. He whispered calm reassurances, unsure if the words mattered or if the tone alone carried meaning. Using warm water, he cleaned the wound carefully, revealing jagged edges that suggested the strike of a large predator. A mountain lion, perhaps, but the depth looked far greater, as though something stronger had torn into it. He wrapped the wound tightly with strips of cloth, feeling the being's muscles tremble beneath the pressure. For the first time, he felt the heat of its body, immense, radiating strength even in weakness. Hours passed as the storm raged on. He sat beside the being on the porch, keeping the lantern lit for comfort rather than visibility. The forest was swallowed in darkness, but the being's breathing slowly steadied, no longer strained or uneven. At one point, it reached out a massive hand and lightly touched his arm, not forcefully, but gently, with surprising delicacy. The gesture stunned him. It was more than acknowledgement. It was trust. A bond forged in the cold, wrapped in silence, grounded in mutual respect. By morning, the storm had passed, and a blanket of snow covered the valley in a shimmering white expanse. The being stood slowly, testing its weight, and flexed its wounded shoulder with a soft grunt. Though still injured, it seemed stronger. Before leaving the porch, it placed one hand on the wooden railing and tapped twice, a familiar signal of recognition. He responded in kind, tapping the railing with the same rhythm. The being lowered its head slightly, then turned and disappeared into the frozen forest with steady, deliberate steps. In the days that followed, he found new tokens left near the cabin, a pile of dried berries arranged neatly in a bowl-shaped depression, a length of braided grass tied in a pattern he did not recognize, and a smooth stone shaped by water into an oval. These offerings were not random, they were expressions of gratitude. Each gift carried meaning beyond human understanding, and he accepted them with reverence, placing them carefully on the wooden shelf inside the cabin. The forest no longer felt like a wild frontier. It felt like a shared space. One crisp dawn, he followed a fresh trail of massive footprints through the snow, deeper than before but still precise. The tracks led him to a pine grove where the being stood waiting, shoulder bandaged with remnants of the cloth he had used. The wound looked better, healed in a way that defied normal recovery speed. The being approached him slowly, stopping just a few steps away. It raised its head toward the sky, releasing a deep, rolling vocalization that echoed across the valley. The sound was powerful yet soft, almost ceremonial. He knew instinctively this was a greeting, a formal acknowledgement of their growing bond. They spent hours in the grove as he practiced the tonal hum he had learned weeks earlier. The being responded patiently, correcting his attempts with subtle shifts in pitch. He noticed its expressions more clearly now, the tightening around the eyes when displeased, the slow blink when relaxed, the slight tilt of the head when curious. For the first time, he felt as though he was not simply coexisting with the forest, he was being taught its unspoken language. Every sound carried weight, every gesture purpose. As the winter deepened, the being began to approach him more frequently, often appearing at the edges of his daily routines. He would chop wood and feel its presence behind a distant tree. He would fetch water and notice its silhouette far up the ridge. It never intruded, never pushed beyond the boundaries they had developed, but it lingered like a guardian, silent, watchful, and impossibly present. Their encounters became a rhythm, a shared cadence shaped by instinct rather than intention. One night, as the moon cast pale light across the snowy clearing, the being returned to the porch. It was not injured, nor did it appear distressed. Instead, it sat on the ground beside the cabin wall, breathing slowly, gazing at the horizon. He joined it, sitting a few feet away, letting the cold air sting his cheeks as they watched the stars flicker above the treetops. No words passed between them, yet the moment carried a depth he had never experienced with another human, a quiet certainty that he had become part of a story older than the mountains themselves. By the end of that winter, he understood that this bond was no accident. The being had chosen him, not out of necessity, but out of recognition. Something in him, perhaps his solitude, his respect for the land, or the quiet discipline with which he moved through the forest, had signaled compatibility. He felt honored, humbled, and quietly transformed. Their connection was no longer a curiosity. It was a partnership. And the forest, once just a place to live, had become a realm of secrets he had only begun to uncover. As spring thawed the last of the winter ice, he noticed the being's behavior shift subtly. It no longer approached the cabin only at night or during storms. Instead, it appeared during the day, moving with quiet confidence through the young greenery. Its presence felt less like a visitor and more like a silent guardian walking familiar territory. He sensed that the forest itself acknowledged their bond, for the animals no longer fled when he approached. Birds perched closer, deer observed him calmly, and even the wind carried a softer tone as it moved through the pines. One morning, while gathering kindling near the ridge, he heard a short, rhythmic tapping on wood. Not the three-knock call he had learned, but a slower, deeper pattern. When he answered with the pattern he knew, there was no response. Instead, he noticed a large branch angled against a tree, placed deliberately, pointing down a narrow deer path. He hesitated only for a moment before following the direction. Each step felt guided, as though the forest had set a trail specifically for him. He knew the being was close, though he couldn't see it. The trail wound through a corridor of tall cedars, their trunks spaced evenly like silent sentinels. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh bark, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in soft streaks. As he walked, he felt a presence above him, moving across branches with silent precision. The being was following him from the treetops, an incredible display of agility for something so massive. He didn't look up. Instead, he continued forward, trusting the path and the quiet weight of the gaze shadowing his steps. Eventually, the path opened into a wide clearing he had never discovered before. Moss-covered stones formed a natural circle along the perimeter, and in the center lay a pool of crystal-clear water fed by a small underground spring. The place felt sacred, untouched by human interference. As he approached the pool, a deep, resonant hum echoed from nearby. The being emerged from between two ancient firs, its posture calm, inviting him forward. This was no accidental meeting. The being had brought him here intentionally. The being knelt beside the pool and dipped its massive hand into the water, letting droplets fall with slow, deliberate motion. It then placed its palm on the mossy ground and looked at him, as if instructing him to mimic the gesture. Unsure but trusting, he did the same, first touching the water, then the earth. The being made a soft rumble of approval. He realized this was a ritual, though simple, meant to connect water, land, and witness. The forest around them seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging the exchange. A moment later, the being stepped aside and pointed toward the base of a large root system exposed by years of erosion. There, half covered by soil and leaves, lay a collection of objects, smooth stones, twisted sticks woven together, and pieces of broken antler arranged in a specific pattern. It looked like a message, a record, or perhaps a teaching tool. When he reached for one of the stones, the being emitted a quick, low sound, not a warning, but a request for caution. He withdrew his hand and observed instead, realizing that some knowledge wasn't meant to be touched, only seen. The being shifted the pattern slightly, pushing the stones to form a new arrangement while keeping the woven sticks in place. It was showing him something. He watched carefully as the shapes transformed. A circle. A line through it. A second circle positioned nearby. Though he didn't understand the exact meaning, he felt the message beneath it, a depiction of movement, territory, or perhaps relationship. The being paused, waiting for him to respond. He drew a simple shape in the dirt, imitating the pattern with hesitation. The being studied his effort, then made a soft, approving exhale. Hours passed as they communicated through shapes, gestures, and low vocalizations. He realized the being was not simply showing him the forest, it was teaching him how to read it. Trails, markers, feeding sites, shelter zones, all hinted through the shapes it demonstrated. The forest was a living map, and the being knew every path, every boundary, every pattern of life that moved within it. By sharing even fragments of this knowledge, the being was inviting him deeper into its world, and trusting him with wisdom passed through generations. As the sun dipped below the trees, the clearing grew dim, but neither of them moved to leave. Instead, the being walked to the far end of the pool and sat with its back against a massive cedar. Its posture was relaxed, almost contemplative. He joined it several feet away, listening to the steady hum of insects rising with the dusk. It felt like sitting with an elder whose presence alone radiated history, an ancient life intertwined with the land long before humans arrived. The atmosphere carried a weight that was both humbling and comforting. When the first stars appeared, the being stood and tapped twice on its chest, then pointed to him. A gesture acknowledging their connection, something like a vow or recognition of partnership. He responded by placing his hand over his heart and bowing slightly. The being made a deep rumble that vibrated through the clearing, not loud, but resonant enough to imprint itself on the moment. Without another gesture, it turned and disappeared silently into the night, leaving him alone with the pool and the whispering trees. Walking back to the cabin under moonlight, he felt transformed. Not because he had discovered a secret creature of the forest, but because he had been welcomed into its domain. The being's teachings were more than lessons, they were invitations. Invitations to see the land not as a resource, but as a living network of balance and meaning. He carried the weight of the day with reverence, knowing he had crossed another threshold in a relationship few could ever imagine. By the time he reached the clearing near his cabin, the footsteps behind him stopped. The being had followed him most of the way, watching from the shadows to ensure his safe return. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The bond between them no longer required sight or words. It lived in the rhythm of their steps, the breath of the forest, and the trust built slowly through shared silence. And he understood. As summer arrived, the forest grew dense with life, and he noticed a change in the being's behavior. It appeared more alert, more guarded, often scanning the tree line before stepping into view. The easy rhythm they had established shifted into something tense and watchful. He sensed danger lurking beyond his understanding. Even the birds seemed quieter, their songs reduced to soft, uncertain calls. One evening, he saw the being standing at the ridge, its posture rigid, head turned sharply as if listening to something distant and unsettling. The next morning, he found a line of trees marked with deep claw-like slashes, angled diagonally across the bark. These were not the gentle signs of communication he had learned. They were warnings, territorial markers, fresh and deliberate. The being stood nearby, partially hidden behind a large cedar, watching him examine the marks. When their eyes met, the being emitted a low, rumbling sound that vibrated with caution. It placed a hand on its chest and then pointed into the deeper forest, signaling him to stay away from that direction. He understood instantly, something dangerous lived beyond those trees. That night, while sitting on the porch, he heard a distant roar unlike anything he had encountered before. It was deeper than a mountain lion, louder than a bear, and layered with a guttural resonance that raised the hair on his arms. The being appeared moments later at the edge of the clearing, its breath heavy and controlled. It looked at him with urgency, tapping the ground twice, then stepping back into the forest. This was no routine visit. The being was warning him to stay inside, to keep the lantern lit, and to trust the boundaries they had silently agreed upon. Hours passed in uneasy silence. The forest felt alive with tension, each rustle amplified by nervous anticipation. Then, a series of heavy footfalls echoed from the direction of the marked trees, slow, dragging steps, accompanied by a faint metallic clicking sound. He held his breath, gripping the edge of the table as the sounds moved closer. Suddenly, they stopped. The forest froze. After a long, agonizing moment, he heard the being release a low, vibrating call. The steps retreated, fading into the distance. Something out there had acknowledged the warning. The next day, he followed the being's tracks to a small clearing where the ground was torn apart by deep gouges and cracked roots. Large tufts of dark fur lay scattered in the dirt, far coarser than the being's lighter, brown fur. Whatever creature had passed through was enormous, powerful, and not part of the familiar rhythms of the forest. The being stood nearby, chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. It gestured toward the damaged ground, then toward the horizon. A message was clear: an intruder had entered its territory, and the forest was no longer safe. As days went by, the being visited more frequently, sometimes staying close to the cabin well into the night. It positioned itself near the porch, sitting with its broad back against the cabin wall, as if guarding more than just its companion. He grew accustomed to hearing the steady cadence of its breathing in the darkness, a reassuring contrast to the uneasy silence beyond the clearing. He felt protected, yet he sensed the being was preparing for something. Something it hoped wouldn't come, but feared might. One evening, while the sun dipped low behind the treetops, the being led him to a secluded glen covered in soft ferns. There, it knelt and began drawing shapes in the dirt with a long, broken branch. The shapes resembled the ones it had shown him before, but this time, they included jagged lines and crossed patterns. Danger. Conflict. Movement. The being pointed toward the forest depths and emitted a short, sharp sound. It was telling him that the intruder moved unpredictably, that it threatened balance, and that he had to avoid certain areas until it was resolved. He listened intently, mimicking gestures and sounds to show understanding. The being responded with a slow nod and tapped its chest twice, a gesture of assurance. But its eyes betrayed concern. They flickered toward the shadows, scanning for movement even in the fading light. He realized then that the being was not only protecting him, it was safeguarding its territory, its lineage, and perhaps others of its kind deeper in the forest. The weight of this unseen world pressed heavily on his mind. The tension peaked one moonless night when distant calls echoed from opposite sides of the valley, low, aggressive roars that shook the windows of the cabin. The being arrived moments later, stepping from the forest with urgency. It positioned itself directly between the cabin and the tree-line, posture tall and defiant. He watched from inside, heart pounding, as two sets of heavy footsteps approached from different directions. For a moment, the forest seemed ready to implode with clashing forces. Then, with a single thunderous call, the being asserted its authority. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed. By dawn, the forest had returned to its usual calm. Birds sang cautiously, as if testing the air for residual danger. The being returned to the cabin, breathing heavily but uninjured. It touched the porch railing with a slow, deliberate motion before turning to face him. The gesture held meaning he couldn't fully decode, but he sensed relief, gratitude, and a reaffirmation of their bond. The threat was not entirely gone, but balance had been restored, for now. In the following days, the being's vigilance softened. It resumed its quiet routines, guiding him to new parts of the forest and teaching him subtle ways to read shifts in the land. Yet their bond felt deeper, forged not only through curiosity but through shared danger. He now understood that the forest was more than a home to the being, it was a world of boundaries, guardianship, and responsibility. And by standing beside the being, he had unknowingly stepped into that responsibility as well. By the end of summer, he realized that the incident had changed their relationship. The being no longer treated him as a mere observer. It saw him as autumn painted the forest in amber and gold. He noticed a profound shift in the being's interactions. Their communication began evolving beyond gestures and simple vocalizations. The being produced new sounds, layered hums, short clicks, and deep resonant pulses that carried emotion and context. At first, he simply listened, overwhelmed by the complexity. But gradually, he began recognizing patterns. A low rising hum meant curiosity. A double click signaled caution. A rolling chest deep tone expressed reassurance. Bit by bit, an unspoken language formed between them. One early morning, the being approached the clearing with deliberate steps and tapped twice on a fallen log. He recognized this as a request to follow. They traveled deeper into the forest than he had ever gone, descending into a lush ravine filled with moss-covered boulders and towering firs. The being stopped near a massive tree whose trunk twisted like ancient rope. It placed one hand against the bark and emitted a deep, sustained vibration. The tree seemed to respond, its leaves trembling as though stirred by something invisible. He stood in awe, realizing the being was communicating not just with him, but with the land itself. The being then motioned for him to place his palm on the bark. He hesitated, unsure of what to expect, but complied. When he touched the tree, he felt the bark vibrate faintly with the remnants of the being's hum. It was warm, not physically, but energetically, as though life pulsed beneath the surface. The being watched him closely, waiting to see if he understood. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and attempted a low hum. Though imperfect, it caused the leaves above to twitch softly. When he opened his eyes, the being gave him a slow, approving blink. They spent hours exploring this organic communication. The being demonstrated how different tones resonated through various parts of the forest. A high-pitched sound triggered subtle movements in small animals hidden under brush. A deep, rumbling tone sent vibrations into the ground, influencing the behavior of insects and nearby birds. He began to see the forest not as a passive environment but as a living network connected through sound, vibration, and intention. The being had always known this. Now, it was sharing the knowledge with him. As days passed, their conversations grew smoother. The being would issue a short hum, and he would respond with his version, often clumsy but increasingly accurate. Sometimes they sat in silence, simply listening to the forest breathe. He began noticing things he had once overlooked: the angle of fallen leaves, the cadence of distant knocking, the shifting patterns of light through branches. These details told stories, warnings, welcomes, or signs of movement. The forest was speaking constantly, and he was finally learning to hear it. One afternoon, while practicing near the ravine, the being suddenly stiffened. Its posture dropped low, shoulders broadening, head turning sharply toward the far ridge. It emitted a quick, complex sound, part click, part growl, part hum. He recognized only fragments: caution, approach, unknown. Something was moving toward them. The being motioned him behind a large boulder and stood in front of him defensively. Minutes later, distant footsteps echoed across the ridge. Heavy, deliberate, and unfamiliar. The being released a strong, rising call that resonated through the valley. The footsteps stopped, then retreated. The message had been received. Once the danger had passed, the being relaxed and turned toward him with a sound he had only heard once before, a soft, descending hum that conveyed relief mixed with reassurance. He realized then that the being was not only teaching him the forest's language but also preparing him to respond to threats when necessary. Their bond had grown beyond companionship; it had become a trust built on survival, awareness, and shared purpose. During the following weeks, the being introduced him to new forms of communication. It scratched patterns into the dirt using sticks, drawing shapes that represented landmarks, water sources, and movement routes. He learned to interpret these symbols, understanding that they served as maps, warnings, or instructions. The being tested him by altering the patterns and waiting to see if he could decipher the changes. Sometimes he succeeded. Other times he failed. But each attempt deepened their connection and expanded his understanding. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountain peaks, they sat at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley. The being tapped its chest, then pointed at the land below, then at him. It hummed a tone that felt ancient and weighty, filled with layers of meaning. He sensed what it was saying: this land is part of him now. Its rhythms, its echoes, its boundaries, he was no longer an outsider. He belonged to its story, and its story belonged to him. The realization humbled him deeply. Back at the cabin, he practiced sounds alone, trying to mimic the being's tonal precision. Sometimes the forest responded with subtle shifts, the rustle of leaves, the distant knock of a branch against bark. He kept a journal of the vibrations he could replicate, noting which ones seemed to influence the forest around him. It wasn't an exact science, but a relational language shaped by intention, emotion, and presence. And every night, he felt the being watching from the tree lean, quietly proud of his progress. By the end of autumn, the language between them had transformed into a living bond. They no longer needed physical gestures to communicate. A single hum or soft exhale carried meaning. A subtle shift in posture conveyed entire thoughts. He felt a connection that transcended human understanding, a quiet, powerful harmony between two beings from different worlds. And he realized that the being had been waiting for someone like him for a long time. Someone willing to listen. Someone willing to learn. Someone willing. As the second winter approached, the being began leading him into parts of the forest he had never imagined existed. These were not simple trails worn by animals or shaped by weather, they were paths carved with intention, following patterns aligned with the contours of the land. The being walked with purpose, occasionally glancing back to ensure he followed closely. He sensed the significance of these places. The air grew heavier, older, as though every step took them deeper into a realm untouched by modern human presence. They arrived at a narrow canyon formed by towering stone walls draped with moss. Sunlight filtered through in thin, shimmering beams, illuminating faint carvings in the rock, shapes resembling hands, circles, and intricate lines. He recognized none of them, yet they radiated meaning. The being placed its palm against one of the carvings and emitted a low, steady hum that echoed softly through the canyon. The stone responded with a subtle vibration. He watched in awe, realizing the canyon was not a natural feature, it was a place of memory. The being motioned for him to place his hand beside its own. When he did, the cold stone thrummed against his palm, carrying echoes of distant history. He felt a strange warmth, as though the rock itself was alive with stories older than any human civilization. The being turned to face him and tapped twice on its chest. The message was clear: these carvings belonged to its lineage, a record of those who had walked the forest long before him. This canyon was a sacred archive, and he had been granted access. As they moved deeper into the canyon, he noticed markings on the ground, giant footprints fossilized in hardened mud, preserved through centuries of sediment. Some were larger than the being's own feet, others slightly smaller, indicating generations of its kind had passed through this place. Each print was perfectly detailed, showing toe impressions and subtle ridges. The being knelt beside one of the larger tracks, laying its hand inside the print, dwarfed by its size. It then looked to him with a soft, descending hum that carried reverence. This was a place of ancestors. Farther along, they reached a chamber-like opening where boulders formed a natural shelter. Inside, the walls were covered with more carvings, this time depicting scenes. Tall figures walking alongside smaller animals. Shapes representing mountains. Patterns illustrating the flow of rivers and seasons. At the center was a depiction of a large figure towering over a cluster of circles, likely representing a clan or family group. The being touched this carving gently, then pointed to itself, then to him. The meaning struck him deeply, he had become part of its circle. He examined the carvings closely, tracing their edges with his fingertips. Some lines appeared newer, carved with sharper precision, while others were weathered almost to invisibility. Generations had added to this archive, leaving their stories etched into stone. The being watched him with patient eyes, aware that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of this revelation. He wasn't just witnessing history, he was being woven into it, one story among countless others shaped by the guardians of this land. They exited the canyon through a narrow gap that opened into an elevated ridge overlooking the entire valley. The view was breathtaking, rolling forests, distant peaks, and a winding river catching the light like silver thread. The being stood beside him, shoulders relaxed, gazing over the land with quiet pride. He realized this vantage point was no random location. It was a place of observation, where the being's ancestors had watched for threats, migrations, and changes in the land. The being emitted a soft, melodic hum that blended with the wind. This was their world, their responsibility. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the being led him along a high trail lined with ancient trees whose trunks twisted in deliberate patterns, grown according to forces he could only guess at. Some branches curved like arches over the trail, forming natural gateways. Others bent outward sharply, marking directions or warnings. He realized these trees were part of a living map, shaped intentionally over generations. The being tapped one of the trunks lightly, producing a hollow sound that carried meaning. It was teaching him how to read the map of the forest itself. They continued until they reached a small clearing marked by a circle of smooth stones. He felt an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The air was still, sacred, heavy with memory. The being stepped into the center of the circle and tapped the ground 3 times. The earth responded with a faint vibration he felt through his boots. He joined the being inside the circle, and together they stood in silence as the last light faded. He sensed this was a place of commitment, a symbolic threshold marking his deeper integration into the being's world. After a long moment, the being extended its arm toward him, palm open. He placed his hand on its palm, feeling the warmth and raw strength beneath the fur. The being made a low, resonant sound that enveloped the clearing. It was not a greeting. It was not instruction. It was an acknowledgement. A bond spoken through sound and earth that tied them across time and memory. He felt tears rising unexpectedly, overwhelmed by the weight of trust placed in him. Walking back under starlight, he felt changed in a way he couldn't articulate. The forest no longer seemed vast and unfathomable. Its secrets now whispered at the edge of his awareness. The being walked beside him not as a watcher but as a companion, their steps synchronized in quiet rhythm. He understood now that their journey was no longer about discovery. It was about inheritance, of knowledge, of responsibility, of connection to something ancient and enduring. By the time they returned to the cabin, the night was deep and silent. The being stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at him for a long moment, as if confirming that he understood the significance of the day. He nodded, heart pounding with purpose. The being then slipped into the shadows, leaving him with a newfound certainty. He now carried a story that belonged not only to him, but to the guardians of the forest. And the deeper he journeyed, the more he realized that the next chapters would reveal truths he never imagined. As the harshest winter in decades descended on the valley, the forest transformed into a world of silence and white. Snow piled high over branches, weighing them down until they bowed like ancient elders under the burden of age. He noticed immediately that the being's movements became rare and cautious. Days passed without a single sign, and an uneasy stillness crept into his thoughts. He had grown accustomed to its presence, its soft hums, its heavy footfalls, its protective watch. Without it, the forest felt colder not just in temperature, but in spirit, as though something essential had gone dormant. One morning, after a night of relentless snowfall, he found the first sign. A large footprint pressed deep into the fresh powder near the tree line, so detailed it captured the texture of the sole. The being had passed through recently, but the print's angle told him something was wrong. It dragged slightly at the heel, showing fatigue. He followed the tracks a short distance before they vanished into the steep hillside, buried under new snowfall. As he stood in the stillness, he felt a wave of dread. The being was alive, but struggling. Days later, during a fierce windstorm, he heard a distant call echo across the valley. It wasn't the being's usual deep hum, but a strained, broken sound that faltered halfway through. He rushed outside, lantern in hand, scanning the treeline through swirling snow. The call repeated, weak, fading. The being was hurt or exhausted. Without hesitation, he packed supplies and followed the faint sound toward the northern ridge. Each step was a battle against the unforgiving winter, but he pressed on, driven by a bond that felt like family. Hours into the search, he found a trail of disturbed snow leading to a narrow ravine. Broken branches lay scattered, some torn clean off trees. Something violent had happened here. At the far end of the ravine, half hidden by snowdrifts, he saw the being collapsed against a rock face. It breathed heavily, each exhale sending clouds of steam into the freezing air. Snow clung to its fur, and its eyes, normally bright amber, looked dim. When it saw him, it released a soft, pained hum, acknowledgement, relief, and warning all at once. He approached slowly, speaking gently, hands raised to show he meant no harm. The being didn't retreat. Instead, it shifted slightly, revealing its injury, a deep wound along its side, likely reopened during a confrontation. He knelt beside it, brushing snow away and assessing the damage. It wasn't fresh, but the cold had worsened it. He applied herbal salves he had carried, using cloth strips to bind the wound tightly. The being winced, gripping the snow with immense hands, but did not resist. It trusted him completely. Night fell quickly, bringing dangerous temperatures. He built a small shelter using branches and a tarp, positioning it to shield the being from the wind. He then lit a modest fire, careful to keep the flames low. The being lay beside him, its breaths ragged but steadying. For hours, he fed the fire, refusing to sleep. The forest remained eerily silent, as if acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Snow fell softly around them, blanketing the world in a fragile, cold stillness that felt both sacred and fragile. By dawn, the being's breathing had improved, though its strength remained low. When he offered water warmed near the fire, it drank slowly, eyes half closed in exhaustion. It tapped his arm weakly, an unmistakable display of gratitude. He felt the weight of the gesture, understanding that the being's survival now depended on him. The roles had reversed. The guardian of the forest needed the human it had once protected. Their bond was no longer just emotional, it was mutual dependence forged through trials. For the next 2 days, he remained in the ravine, tending the being and keeping the fire alive. At night, he heard distant echoes, soft, rhythmic knocks from far across the valley. Other beings, perhaps, signaling or searching. The injured guardian responded with faint clicks and hums, but he suspected its calls were too weak to carry far. Still, the forest felt alive with awareness, as though a network of watchers sensed the struggle unfolding in the snow-covered ravine. On the 3rd day, the being attempted to stand. Its legs trembled under its massive weight, and it stumbled before catching itself on the rock wall. He supported it with all the strength he could muster, guiding it to lean against a sturdy cedar trunk. The being breathed deeply, gathering its remaining energy. Slowly, it tapped its chest once, then pointed toward the west. It wanted to return to a place he had never been, the heart of its territory, hidden deep within untouched forest. The journey was arduous. Snow rose to their knees, and the wind cut like blades. Yet the being pressed forward despite its injury, moving with determination born from ancestral instinct. He followed close beside it, offering support whenever it faltered. At last, they reached a dense thicket marked by arching trees. The being stopped, placing both hands on the trunks, emitting a low, resonant hum. The trees parted, revealing a sheltered grove untouched by the worst of winter. It was warm, protected, and sacred, a healing ground. Inside the grove, the being collapsed to its knees, breathing heavily but safely. The air here felt different, warmer, alive with quiet energy. He knelt beside it, touching the ground with reverence. The being made a soft, steadying hum, a sound filled with relief, trust, and acceptance. It had brought him to a place no human had likely seen for generations. A sanctuary. A place of recovery. A place that confirmed the depth of their connection. As night settled gently over the grove, he built a fire and watched the being finally rest without pain. Snow fell softly beyond the protective canopy, but inside the sacred circle, peace reigned. He realized then that he was no longer a visitor in the being's world. He was an ally, chosen through experience, loyalty, and compassion. And as he watched the being sleep, he understood that the next chapter of their 20-year bond would reveal truths that stretched far deeper than survival, truths about legacy, protection, and the. As winter slowly loosened its grip, the grove became a sanctuary not only for the being but for him as well. The days grew quieter, filled with soft winds and filtered sunlight that slipped through the protective arch of trees. The being healed gradually, its strength returning in slow, powerful waves. Yet something had changed in its behavior. It no longer kept him at a distance from certain parts of the grove. Instead, it encouraged him to explore, guiding him with soft gestures. It was preparing him for something significant, something ancient. One late afternoon, while tending the small fire, he heard a pattern of distant knocks echoing through the forest. They were rhythmic, deliberate, and unlike the cautious signals he had heard before. The being stood tall, listening with intense focus. Its posture shifted, alert but not afraid. It responded with a deep, resonant hum that carried across the grove like a wave. Moments later, another set of knocks answered from the opposite direction. He realized with a rising chill that these were not warnings. They were summons. The being motioned for him to follow and led him to the edge of the grove. There, it placed one large hand on his shoulder and held it firmly, looking into his eyes with gravity he had never seen before. The meaning was unmistakable, what he was about to witness was sacred. A moment later, the being stepped into the forest's shadowed corridors with confident, purposeful strides. He followed close behind, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and reverence. The forest felt charged, alive with intention. They reached a wide clearing he had never seen, even during their many explorations. The ground was covered in soft moss that glowed faintly under the moonlight. The air was thick with an ancient energy he couldn't explain. As he stood in silence, the first figure emerged from the trees, another being, massive and powerful, its fur darker and its eyes older, reflecting wisdom carved through centuries. It stepped into the clearing with a slow, deliberate gait, hums vibrating deep in its chest. Then another appeared. And another. Soon, 4 beings encircled the clearing, each distinct in size, age, and stature. Some bore gray streaks in their fur. Others carried scars across their shoulders and arms. They communicated in low tones, exchanging vibrations and soft knocks against trees. The guardian he knew stepped forward and issued a long, harmonious call. It echoed through the clearing like a ceremonial announcement. The gathering had begun. He stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. These were not solitary wanderers, nor mythical shadows. They were a community, a lineage of forest guardians who lived quietly, deliberately, hidden from human chaos. He had been granted access to something few humans ever glimpsed. As the beings formed a half-circle, their deep hums combined into a resonant harmony that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. It felt like a greeting, an ancient ritual acknowledging presence and kinship. The being beside him nudged him gently, guiding him forward. He hesitated, but its soft exhale encouraged him to step closer. When he entered the half-circle, the hums shifted tone, lower, softer, almost welcoming. One of the elders approached him, towering even higher than the guardian he knew. Its eyes were deep amber, filled with history and unspoken understanding. It extended an open hand toward him, palm up, waiting. Trembling, he placed his hand over its palm. A surge of emotion hit him. The elder's hum vibrated through his bones, filling him with warmth, acceptance, and an overwhelming sense of belonging. This was no random encounter. The beings were acknowledging him as part of their extended circle, a rare and profound honor. The elder tapped his chest gently, then tapped its own. The message resonated clearly: shared trust, shared responsibility, shared path. The gathering continued in slow, rhythmic motion. The beings communicated through patterns of sound and gesture, their voices harmonizing in ways that felt both primal and intelligent. At one point, a smaller being, likely younger, approached him with cautious curiosity. It studied him closely, sniffing the air near his hands before giving a soft, amused click. He smiled, realizing the young one saw him not as a threat but as something unusual, perhaps even interesting. As the night deepened, the beings formed a full circle around him and the guardian. They began a unified hum, a deep, layered vibration that echoed through the valley and seemed to resonate with the very heartbeat of the forest. The guardian placed its hand on his shoulder once more, anchoring him in the moment. He realized this ceremony wasn't simply a gathering, it was a recognition. They were formally acknowledging the bond he and the guardian had formed, accepting him as an ally to their hidden world. Hours passed like moments. Eventually, the harmony faded, and the beings stepped back into the shadows one by one. The elder paused before disappearing, offering him a slow nod of respect. The young one gave a soft chirp of farewell. Finally, only the guardian remained at his side. Together, they walked back to the grove under the canopy of stars. The forest felt larger now, deeper, filled with unseen connections he had only just begun to comprehend. Back in the grove, the guardian tapped the ground once, a gesture of completion. He sat beside the being in silence, overwhelmed and humbled by what he had experienced. He understood now that his relationship with the guardian was not an isolated miracle, it was part of a lineage of trust that stretched back generations. And as he traced the grove's soft earth with his fingertips, he knew the next chapter of their 20-year journey would reveal even deeper truths about the ancient world he had been welcomed into. As spring returned to the mountains once more, he felt the forest beginning to shift in subtle, powerful ways. The trees seemed to breathe with deeper rhythm, the rivers carried a stronger pulse, and the winds whispered with layered voices he had never noticed before. His senses had changed. No longer guided solely by human instinct, he now moved with awareness shaped by the guardian's teachings. Every sound carried meaning. Every vibration suggested intention. The forest was no longer a place he walked through, it was a world that acknowledged his presence. Weeks after the gathering, the guardian led him along a ridge path marked only by faint curves in the earth, almost invisible to an untrained eye. The air grew heavier the farther they traveled, filled with scents of pine resin, fresh soil, and something ancient that defied description. Eventually, they reached a steep descent into a valley he had never visited. The guardian paused, looking back at him with slow, deliberate breaths. This was a threshold. He could feel it in his bones. He nodded, accepting whatever truth waited below. The valley opened into a wide basin shielded by towering cliffs. In the center stood a massive, gnarled tree with roots twisting outward like ancient limbs. Its trunk was thicker than any tree he had ever seen, its bark marked with deep grooves that seemed to glow faintly when the sunlight struck them. The guardian approached the tree with reverence, touching its trunk with both hands and emitting a low, melodic hum. The air vibrated around them. He felt the ground tremble gently beneath his feet, as if responding to the call. When he touched the tree, an overwhelming sensation washed over him, warmth, memory, and something akin to presence. He felt echoes of past generations, their lives etched into the ancient wood through countless seasons. It was a living archive, carrying the stories of those who had walked these forests long before humans built their cities. The guardian watched him closely, waiting to see if he understood. He whispered softly, acknowledging the tree with gratitude. For the first time, he felt not like an observer, but like a participant in a legacy stretching through millennia. The guardian then knelt and began tracing patterns in the soil, circles, lines, and shapes reminiscent of the markings he had learned in the sacred canyon. But these patterns were more intricate, more deliberate, telling a story that unfolded in slow motion. He recognized symbols representing family, territory, memory, and danger. Others were new, depicting transitions, bonds, and inheritance. When the guardian finished, it tapped the center circle and pointed to him. His breath caught in his chest. The guardian wasn't just teaching him. It was passing something on. A soft breeze moved through the valley, carrying with it the faint sound of distant hums. Other guardians, perhaps the same ones he had seen in the gathering, were calling from far away. Their tones were calm, steady, acknowledging. The guardian responded with a long, resonant call that echoed across the cliffs. It then looked at him with an expression he had grown to understand deeply. This was a farewell ceremony. Not an ending, but a transition. The guardian had fulfilled its role, and now he was meant to carry knowledge forward in ways he had never anticipated. He felt a deep ache rise within him. 20 years of companionship, trust, danger, and wonder had bound them in ways he could hardly articulate. He stepped closer and placed his hand on the guardian's chest, feeling its powerful heartbeat beneath his palm. The guardian covered his hand gently, its immense fingers curling with a tenderness that defied its strength. It emitted a sound he had never heard before, a low, trembling tone filled with emotion, gratitude, and something that felt like pride. The valley seemed to hold its breath. The guardian released his hand and stepped back, tapping its own chest once, then pointing at him. The meaning was unmistakable. The bond they shared was permanent, but its form would change. The guardian turned toward the cliffs and gave a final call, deep, steady, resonant. From far away, the forest answered with scattered knocks, hums, and rhythmic vibrations. He realized they were acknowledging him as well. Accepting him. Recognizing him. The forest had woven him into its story. As the guardian walked toward the trembling line between sunlight and shadow, he felt the weight of the moment settle into his heart. The being paused once, looking back with eyes that carried decades of shared truth. Then it stepped into the darker corridor of the valley, moving with deliberate pace until its silhouette merged with the living wall of trees. He watched until the last hint of its fur blended into the shadows. The silence that followed felt heavy, sacred, final. He stood alone in the valley, surrounded by the ancient tree and the echoes of a world he had once doubted existed. He touched the bark again, feeling the subtle vibrations that carried the guardian's lingering presence. He understood now that he had not merely witnessed an extraordinary creature. He had lived alongside a keeper of ancient knowledge, a protector of balance, a being connected to the land in ways human language could never fully define. And he had been chosen to remember. Walking back through the forest, he noticed how the wind shifted around him, bending differently as though adjusting to his presence. The birds sang with new patterns, and even the ground beneath his feet seemed to acknowledge his steps. He carried the weight of 20 years, a weight built from silence, trust, danger, and deep connection. The forest was no longer a place he visited. It had become part of him. Its language lived in him. Its rhythm guided him. And though the guardian had returned to its lineage, their bond remained unbroken. By the time he reached his cabin, dusk covered the mountains in warm gold and deepening blue. He paused at the threshold, listening to the forest breathe. A soft hum drifted through the trees, not from the guardian, but from the land itself, echoing memory and unity. He closed his eyes. He often stood at the edge of the clearing in the years that followed, listening to the wind drift through the pines the way it had during his earliest encounters. Each sound carried echoes of a presence no longer beside him, yet never truly gone. The forest still breathed with the same rhythm he had learned to understand, soft hums in the branches, quiet vibrations in the ground, subtle shifts in the air. Though he walked alone, he felt accompanied by 20 years of memory woven into every trail and shadow around him. At times, he found new markings on trees, faint scratches that hadn't been there the day before, or branches deliberately angled toward paths he recognized as sacred. They were signs of visitation, silent reminders that the guardians had not forgotten him. He touched these signs gently, acknowledging each one with gratitude. The forest never returned to its old, distant silence. Instead, it held a lingering warmth, a living memory of a bond formed through trust and sacrifice, a connection that weathered seasons and storms. He often reflected on everything the guardian had taught him: the language of vibrations, the meaning of carved symbols, the rhythm of knocks, the patterns of movement that spoke of danger or peace. These lessons shaped the way he moved through the world. His footsteps became quieter, his awareness sharper, his respect for the land deeper. Even in solitude, he carried those teachings into every moment of his days, guided by instincts no ordinary life could have gifted him. When he spoke of the guardian, he didn't describe it as a creature or a legend. He spoke of it as a presence, ancient, wise, deliberate. A being who had chosen to trust him when trust was rare, who had shared its world slowly and without force. The memory of that trust brought him comfort in moments of loneliness. It reminded him that connection could exist across the boundaries of species, language, and understanding. It reminded him that some relationships were carved not in words, but in silence, gestures, and shared survival. On certain nights, under a sky full of stars, he returned to the grove where the guardian had healed during the brutal winter. The trees still formed a protective arch overhead, and the air still held that quiet glow of sanctuary. He sat beside the old fire pit, closing his eyes to revisit the moment when he had looked into the guardian's eyes and felt history pulse behind them. The grove, unchanged by time, felt like a heartbeat preserved in the forest, slow, steady, eternal. There were evenings when distant hums drifted through the valley, carried by the wind like forgotten songs. He knew they didn't belong to the guardian but to others of its lineage, voices layered with age and strength. He responded with the tones he had learned, shaping his breath into harmonies that echoed faintly through the pines. Sometimes the forest answered. Other times, only silence returned. But either way, he felt connected, wrapped in the unseen threads of a world that still watched over him. Over the years, he documented everything he remembered about the guardian: the signs, the paths, the rituals, the gathering, the ancient tree. Not to expose it, but to preserve the truth for those who might one day understand. He wrote about the way the guardian protected him, taught him, and welcomed him into places no human footsteps had touched for generations. And in every page, he honored the bond that had shaped him into someone more attentive, more patient, more attuned to the quiet wisdom of the land. He knew that most people would doubt his story. They would laugh, dismiss it as fantasy, or explain it away with science that refused to stretch beyond its familiar boundaries. Yet he never felt anger toward them. Not everyone was meant to see what he had seen. Not everyone was meant to walk the hidden trails or touch the ancient carvings. The forest chose who it revealed itself to, and he had been fortunate, chosen through circumstance, character, and an open heart. As he grew older, the forest became more than a home. It became a companion, a keeper of shared secrets. The guardian's influence shaped the way he viewed the world beyond the trees, how he treated people, how he respected silence, how he recognized meaning in stillness. Every lesson he carried from those 20 years made him feel closer to the earth, grounded in a purpose that transcended the narrow concerns of daily life. The forest had become the pulse beneath his existence. Sometimes, when the moon hung low over the mountains, he walked to the canyon of ancient carvings. The markings glowed faintly under moonlight, alive with memory. He placed his hand against the stone the way the guardian once had, feeling the familiar vibration hum through his palm. It comforted him, reminding him that the guardian's lineage continued, watching, remembering, living. The stone carried stories of the past, but now it carried his story too, etched in the quiet places where only echoes speak. In the final chapters of his life, He understood the greatest truth the Guardian had tried to teach him: the world was far larger than humans believed, shaped by forces far older and wiser than any written history. There were guardians of balance, protectors of forests, watchers who lived between shadow and moonlight. And they were not myths. They were memories carved into the bones of the earth, moving silently in the spaces where human footsteps rarely ventured. Whenever he heard a faint knock in the distance, 3 slow, deliberate taps, he knew it was not imagination. It was acknowledgement. A reminder. A promise. The forest had not forgotten him. And he would never forget the Guardian who had walked beside him through danger, through silence, through 20 years of shared truth. Their worlds would forever remain connected, bound through sound, memory, and the quiet certainty that he had touched something eternal, something few humans ever would.